They thought it was going to be just another tense day in Washington. Reporters sat with their pens ready, lawmakers shuffled in their seats, and aides whispered nervously, preparing for another long session. But what unfolded inside the chamber that afternoon wasn't just politics as usual. It was a spectacle that stunned everyone who witnessed it. In the middle of the hearing, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, one of the most respected voices on the bench, suddenly leaned forward. Her voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the room like a knife. "Sit down." The words weren't soft. They weren't casual. They were forceful. They carried the weight of authority built over decades, and they were aimed directly at one of the most outspoken members of Congress, Jasmine Crockett. The room froze. Even the air felt heavier. For a split second, silence consumed everything. Every camera lens locked on. Every journalist's fingers froze over their keyboards. People weren't just watching history. They were holding their breath, wondering what would come next. And then it happened. Jasmine Crockett, known for her boldness and refusal to be silenced, didn't flinch. She didn't move back. Instead, her chin lifted slightly, her eyes narrowed, and she stared directly at Justice Sotomayor. Her body language screamed defiance. In that moment, this wasn't just about a justice demanding order. It wasn't just about a congresswoman refusing to yield. It was a collision of two forces: authority versus resistance, tradition versus disruption. Some lawmakers gasped. Others looked away, unwilling to witness what could turn into a full-blown standoff. But the truth was undeniable. Nobody in that chamber would forget what they were seeing, because what Jasmine Crockett did next would send shockwaves far beyond those walls. It would ignite headlines, spark debates across the country, and leave millions asking the same question. Did a justice just lose control of her own courtroom? This was no longer a routine session. This was a showdown. To understand why this moment shook the nation, you first have to understand the two women at the center of it all. Because this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a clash of identities, histories, and legacies. Justice Sonia Sotomayor is no stranger to commanding a room. Born in the Bronx to Puerto Rican parents, she climbed her way up from humble beginnings to become the first Latina justice on the Supreme Court of the United States. Her life story has been celebrated as the American dream in motion, a symbol of resilience, discipline, and achievement. On the bench, Sotomayor has built her reputation as a sharp thinker, a tough questioner, and above all, a figure who carries an aura of authority wherever she goes. When she speaks, people listen. When she gives an order, people follow. That's the weight of decades spent in the highest corridors of law. Now, on the other side of this confrontation stood Jasmine Crockett. If Sotomayor represents the establishment, Crockett embodies disruption. A fiery congresswoman from Texas, she has built her brand on refusing to be silenced. Known for her unapologetic style, sharp tongue, and fearless energy, Crockett doesn't back down from anyone. Not her political opponents, not the media, and certainly not those who try to put her in her place. Her supporters love her for it. To them, she's a warrior who says what others are too afraid to say. But her critics, they call her reckless, confrontational, even dangerous. Either way, one thing is clear: she is impossible to ignore. So when these two worlds collided, the unshakable authority of a justice and the fearless defiance of a congresswoman, sparks were bound to fly. The very idea of telling Jasmine Crockett to sit down was like striking a match near gasoline. It wasn't just an instruction, it was a challenge. And for someone like Crockett, challenges aren't something she avoids. They're something she runs straight toward. People in that chamber already knew this tension had been brewing. Crockett had been outspoken in recent weeks, clashing with opponents on national television and sparking heated arguments during committee hearings. And Sotomayor, though respected, had been criticized in some circles for being too patient, too restrained, a justice who rarely lost her composure. To see her voice crack like a whip that day was shocking in itself. But to see that command directed at someone like Crockett made the moment combustible. It's important to note, This wasn't just about personalities. This was about power. Sotomayor represented the order of the court, the rules, the authority, the centuries-old institution that demands respect. Crockett represented the voice of the people, raw and untamed, challenging that very structure. One demanded silence, the other demanded to be heard. And so, as the cameras zoomed in, as journalists scribbled furiously, and as millions across the country tuned in later to watch the clip on repeat, the stage was set. This was more than a clash. It was a symbol of a much deeper divide in America itself. The struggle between tradition and disruption, authority and defiance, silence and speech. By the time Justice Sotomayor uttered those two words, "Sit down," the collision was inevitable. And Jasmine Crockett, true to her nature, was never going to go quietly. The air inside the chamber was heavy, as though the walls themselves sensed what was coming. Reporters shifted in their seats, whispering quietly, their pens poised above notebooks. Lawmakers sat upright, some leaning forward, sensing tension even before the first words were spoken. And then, with a voice that carried the full weight of her authority, Justice Sonia Sotomayor leaned forward and cut through the noise like a blade through silence. "Sit down." 2 words, just 2, but they struck with the force of a hammer hitting steel. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to pause. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. The words lingered in the air, bouncing off the chamber walls, growing louder in the silence that followed. It wasn't just a command, it was a declaration. A justice of the Supreme Court had spoken, and when a justice speaks, the expectation is that the world will listen. But Jasmine Crockett was not the type to listen. She froze at first, not because she was intimidated, but because she understood the weight of that moment. She could have chosen silence. She could have lowered her eyes, taken her seat, and let the authority of the bench crush her into submission. Many before her had done exactly that. But Crockett was different. Her supporters didn't admire her because she followed orders. They admired her because she didn't. Slowly, her chin lifted. Her eyes, sharp and unflinching, locked directly onto Justice Sotomayor's. The stillness in her posture carried more power than 1,000 words. Every camera in the chamber zoomed in. You could see the fire in her eyes, the defiance written across her face. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The silence broke with a ripple of gasps from those sitting nearby. Aides glanced nervously at each other. Some lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, unwilling to be caught staring. But the truth was undeniable. Nobody could look away. The standoff was magnetic, pulling every eye, every lens, every heartbeat into the tension between these two women. And then the whispers began. Quiet, nervous, but impossible to ignore. A soft murmur ran through the crowd as people leaned toward each other, as though afraid to speak too loudly in the presence of such raw tension. Did that really just happen? One reporter whispered to another. "She's not going to back down," a staffer muttered under her breath. For decades, Sotomayor had commanded respect with nothing more than her presence. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't moved. She wasn't intimidated by robes or titles or the silent expectation of submission. She was standing in that room not just as a congresswoman but as a symbol of a new generation, a generation unwilling to bow. Her lips parted. Her voice, calm but steady, cut through the murmurs. "With all due respect, I will be heard." The room erupted. Gasps filled the air like a wave crashing onto shore. Some clapped their hands to their mouths. Others shook their heads in disbelief. It wasn't just the words, it was the audacity. To respond to a justice in such a way was unheard of. It was the kind of defiance that could define or destroy a career. Sotomayor's face hardened. Her jaw tightened, and for the briefest of moments her composure cracked. Those who knew her well could see it. The flash of irritation, the sharpness in her gaze. She had faced some of the brightest legal minds in the nation, endured hours of heated questioning. But this was different. This wasn't a legal argument. This was raw defiance, direct and personal, and Jasmine didn't move an inch. She stood tall, her hands steady, her eyes unflinching. It was as if she had been preparing for this very moment her entire life. The cameras captured every second. Across the country, millions who would later watch the clip on repeat would see it play out like a scene from a movie. The justice on the bench, the Congresswoman standing her ground, the silence that followed each word like thunder rolling in the distance. Inside the chamber, though the moment was almost unbearable, the silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was electricity. It was the kind of silence that vibrates in the air, thick and charged, as though one wrong move could shatter everything, and then came the ripple effect. One by one, lawmakers began to react. Some avoided eye contact, burying their attention into papers or pretending to check their phones. Others leaned back in their chairs, smirking quietly, almost entertained by the unfolding drama. A few even looked impressed, as though they had just witnessed something historic. But for Sotomayor, this wasn't entertainment. This was her courtroom, her authority, her rules, and in that instant she had been challenged in a way she hadn't expected. Her hand tightened against the bench. Her voice, when it finally came, was lower, colder. This is not the place. But Jasmine Crockett's stance didn't waver. She didn't sit. She didn't move. Instead, she let the silence linger again, forcing the justice and everyone else in the room to absorb the full weight of her defiance. For the next several minutes, the chamber became a battlefield of silence and stares. Every second stretched into eternity. Every breath carried the risk of breaking the fragile balance. But through it all, Crockett stood tall, refusing to yield. And that was the moment everyone realized. This wasn't just a clash. This was a test of authority, of resilience, of who would break first. The answer shocked the world. When Jasmine Crockett finally opened her mouth to respond, every single person in that chamber leaned in. You could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Most people would have folded under that pressure, lowered their head, taken their seat, swallowed their pride. But Jasmine wasn't most people. Her voice came steady, calm, but firm enough to slice through the silence like glass breaking. With all due respect, I will be heard. 7 words. That was all it took to turn a command into a confrontation, and a confrontation into a moment that would be replayed across every news network in America. The reaction was immediate. Some lawmakers gasped audibly, as if Jasmine had just crossed an invisible line that no one was supposed to cross. Others exchanged quick, nervous glances, whispering under their breath. A few even looked impressed, their expressions almost saying, "She actually said it." But Jasmine didn't stop there. She didn't let the silence swallow her words. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes still locked on Justice Sotomayor, and added, "I was elected to speak, and I will not be silenced." The chamber erupted in whispers again. This wasn't just defiance, it was declaration. Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply refusing an order, she was asserting her identity, her authority, her right to stand toe-to-toe with one of the most powerful figures in American law. Justice Sotomayor's reaction was subtle, but the cameras caught it. Her jaw tightened, her glasses shifted slightly as she leaned back in her chair, and for the briefest second, her eyes narrowed. Those who had followed her career knew what that meant. Irritation. Real irritation. For Sotomayor, authority was never something she had to fight for. It was given to her, earned through decades of service, reinforced by the black robe she wore. But now, in front of cameras, in front of lawmakers, and in front of the nation, her authority was being tested in the rawest way possible. And Jasmine Crockett knew exactly what she was doing. Her tone never cracked. Her posture never faltered. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't begging. She was calm, collected, and unshakably firm. That, more than anything else, is what made the moment so powerful. Because this wasn't rage. It was resolve. Within minutes, clips of the exchange began circulating online. Reporters in the chamber had barely typed out their first headlines before Twitter, or X, as some now call it, exploded with reactions. Hashtags like "You Can Sit Down Showdown" and "Eater Crockett v. Sotomayor" started trending. Some users praised Crockett as a fearless fighter who spoke truth to power. Others condemned her as disrespectful, reckless, and unfit for public office. Cable news channels interrupted their regular programming to air the clip. Pundits lined up on both sides of the argument. One commentator declared, "This was the moment Jasmine Crockett secured her place as the loudest voice of a new generation." Another fired back. This was nothing more than dangerous grandstanding, a disgrace to the institution. But regardless of where people stood, nobody could ignore it. Inside the chamber, however, the moment wasn't over. Jasmine's words still hung in the air, and all eyes were on Justice Sotomayor. Would she push back harder? Would she silence the Congresswoman by force of authority? Or would she let the challenge stand? Sotomayor shifted in her seat. For years, she had built her reputation on balance, being firm but fair, unshaken but not easily provoked. Yet, here she was, facing someone who refused to yield, someone who met her authority with equal force. The quiet tension was unbearable. But Jasmine didn't blink. She had already said what she needed to say. She had already declared to the entire country that she would not be silenced. And in many ways, that was enough. For her supporters, it was a moment of triumph, proof that she could stand against the establishment and not flinch. For her critics, it was confirmation of their fears, that she was uncontrollable, defiant to the point of recklessness. Either way, Jasmine Crockett had just etched her name into the political memory of America, because the truth was undeniable. In a chamber where most voices trembled before authority, hers rang out strong. This wasn't just a response. It was a statement, and it would ripple far beyond the four walls of that chamber. What happened inside that chamber wasn't just about a justice and a congresswoman. It was about something far bigger, a question that has haunted democracies for centuries. When authority commands silence, does the voice of defiance strengthen or crumble? On one side stood Justice Sonia Sotomayor, cloaked in the black robe of the Supreme Court. That robe itself carries centuries of tradition, power, and respect. It is not just clothing. It is a symbol of the highest authority in American law. Every time she enters a courtroom, that robe announces her presence before she even speaks, and her words, no matter how few, are supposed to carry weight like scripture. On the other side was Jasmine Crockett. No robe, no decades on the bench, just her voice, her conviction, and the political fire that fuels her career. She represents something raw, something unpolished, the defiance of a generation that refuses to be boxed in by titles, robes, or unwritten rules. Where Sotomayor embodies stability, Crockett embodies disruption. That's why the command, "Sit down," was more than a simple order. It was the collision of two worlds, authority demanding silence, defiance demanding to be heard. The chamber itself became a metaphor for this battle. The rows of lawmakers shifting in their seats mirrored the nation's divide. Some wanted order, respect, and tradition. Others wanted resistance, boldness, and a voice that refuses to yield. Each reaction inside those walls reflected the reactions rippling outside them, across television screens, news articles, and social media feeds. And the symbolism ran even deeper. In American history, clashes between authority and defiance have often marked turning points. From courtroom protests to fiery speeches on the Senate floor, it's always been the moments where someone refused to sit down that ended up shaping the narrative of change. Supporters of Jasmine Crockett saw her as carrying that legacy. To them, her refusal wasn't disrespect, it was courage. It was standing up against the weight of authority and saying, "My voice matters too." In their eyes, she wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for every unheard, silenced, or underestimated voice in America. But her critics saw something very different. To them, Crockett's defiance wasn't noble, it was reckless. They argued that institutions only survive when their authority is respected. If lawmakers openly challenge the Supreme Court in public, what's next? If a justice's command can be brushed aside, where does it stop? For them, the moment wasn't inspiring. It was dangerous. This was the essence of the clash. The old guard defending authority, the new guard questioning it. Sotomayor had spent a lifetime building respect within a system rooted in tradition. Crockett had built her name by tearing through traditions that tried to cage her. And now, in one electrifying moment, their paths crossed in front of the world. The power of the moment wasn't in what was said, but in what it represented. One side demanded obedience. The other demanded recognition. And for a few tense minutes, neither side backed down. In that sense, the clash wasn't just personal, it was national. It wasn't just Sotomayor versus Crockett. It was authority versus resistance. It was the system versus the voice of defiance. It was the weight of history against the fire of the present. And the reason it stunned so many? Because deep down, everyone watching knew this was bigger than two women. It was a mirror reflecting America's own struggle. A struggle between order and upheaval, tradition and rebellion, silence and speech. That's why the clip went viral. That's why the debate raged on TV and online. Because in that moment, every viewer saw their own reflection in the clash. Were they with the justice, guarding order and respect? Or were they with the Congresswoman, refusing to sit down, refusing to stay silent? This wasn't just about a courtroom command anymore. It was about power itself. Who holds it, who challenges it, and what happens when the two collide in front of the entire nation. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's explosive words didn't just hang in the chamber. It echoed. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed the electricity, bouncing it back, amplifying the weight of what had just happened. Justice Sonia Sotomayor sat frozen for a fraction of a second, her jaw tight, her glasses perched on the edge of her nose. She had issued a command, "Sit down." And for the first time in her long career, that command had been met not with obedience, not with hesitation, but with open defiance. The ripple spread instantly. Lawmakers who had once been slouched back in their chairs were now sitting bolt upright, their eyes darting between Crockett and Sotomayor like spectators at a boxing match. Some were horrified. Others, secretly, were thrilled. This wasn't just drama. This was history unfolding. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Did she just say that to a justice? One aide muttered under their breath. "This is going to be on every screen by tonight," another whispered as they scrambled to text their contacts in the media. And they were right. Because in the age of instant clips and viral headlines, every second of this clash was already being packaged for the outside world. But inside the chamber, the weight of the moment was suffocating. Sotomayor adjusted her glasses, leaned forward again, and this time her voice was slower, more deliberate, dripping with both authority and warning. "Congresswoman, you are out of line." The words carried the sting of steel. But Crockett, still standing tall, did not retreat. Her voice, calm yet firm, cut back through the tension. "Respect is earned, not demanded. And I will not be silenced when the truth is at stake." Gasps filled the chamber. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was open defiance in the face of one of the highest judicial authorities in the land. For some, it was unthinkable. For others, it was exhilarating. And then came the divide. Lawmakers started shifting almost instinctively into sides. Some pounded their fists on the desk, whispering, "Order! Order!" desperately trying to restore decorum. Others leaned forward with smirks, clearly enjoying every second of the chaos. The chamber wasn't unified anymore. It was fractured, visibly split down the middle. Outside, the media frenzy had already begun. Headlines like "Crockett defies Supreme Court Justice in stunning clash" and "Unprecedented showdown on Capitol Hill" flashed across screens. Twitter feeds exploded. Commentators raced to spin the story. Was this the beginning of a constitutional crisis? Was Jasmine Crockett a hero for standing her ground, or a villain undermining the institution? Back inside, the standoff continued. Sotomayor's hand tightened on the bench. Crockett's fists clenched at her sides. Every eye was locked on them, every ear straining for the next word. Would Sotomayor escalate and attempt to silence Crockett with formal power? Or would Crockett's defiance ignite something even larger? A chain reaction that no one could control. The answer wasn't clear yet. But what was clear was this: Washington had never seen anything like it. The foundations of power, Judicial authority, legislative independence, and personal conviction had just collided in full public view. And the aftershocks, they were only beginning. Because as the chamber divided, one thing became certain. Whatever happened next would not just define Jasmine Crockett and Sonia Sotomayor, it would define the entire political landscape for years to come. The air inside the chamber was razor-sharp, heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew they were witnessing a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered for years to come. Justice Sonia Sotomayor and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood locked in a silent duel, neither backing down, neither willing to yield. Authority versus resistance. Tradition versus disruption. Finally, Sotomayor broke the silence. Her gavel slammed down. Bang! 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 The sound echoing like cannon fire. "Order in this chamber!" She thundered, her voice firm, commanding, unshakable. For decades, when Sotomayor spoke, people listened. But not this time. Not today. Jasmine Crockett didn't sit. She didn't waver. Instead, she raised her voice louder than ever, letting it cut through the chamber like lightning. "You can hit that gavel 100 times, Justice, but you cannot silence the people. And you cannot silence me." The explosion of reactions was immediate. Half the chamber erupted in applause, others shouted for decorum, and aides scrambled in panic, knowing the cameras were capturing every second. This wasn't just chaos. This was history, written in real time. Sotomayor leaned forward, her glare sharp, her patience visibly tested. "Congresswoman, if you refuse to respect this court, you risk undermining the very institution that upholds our democracy." But Crockett's reply came without hesitation, steady and unflinching. Democracy is not upheld by silence. It is upheld by truth. And if that truth makes the powerful uncomfortable, so be it. The words were a thunderclap. Even her opponents couldn't deny the raw power of the statement. It wasn't just defiance anymore. It was a declaration. At that exact moment, the chamber transformed from a courtroom into an arena. Voices clashed. Some lawmakers rushed to Crockett's defense, others rallied behind Sotomayor. It was no longer about a single command or a single refusal. It had become a war of visions. What kind of democracy would America embrace? One rooted in authority and tradition, or one where defiance in the name of truth could shake even the highest seat of power? The standoff reached its peak when Sotomayor finally sat back, her eyes never leaving Crockett. Instead of escalating further, she made a different choice, one that stunned everyone. She removed her glasses, set them gently on the bench, and in a voice colder than steel, said, "Very well, Congresswoman, you've chosen your stand. History will judge you." And with that, the gavel struck one final time. The chamber erupted into chaos. Reporters racing out to file stories, lawmakers shouting over one another, cameras flashing non-stop. Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, walked out of the chamber with her head high, flanked by supporters who treated her like a champion walking out of the ring after a victory. Outside, the reaction was immediate and ferocious. On cable news, commentators shouted over each other, "Disrespectful," "Courageous," "Unprecedented." Social media lit up like wildfire. Clips of the showdown racked up millions of views within hours. Hashtags trended worldwide. Crockett v. Sotomayor, Idiker sit down, showdown. Idiker defiance or disrespect. Some hailed Crockett as the voice of a new generation, bold, unapologetic, unwilling to bow to tradition. Others condemned her as reckless, accusing her of shattering the norms that held the system together. But love her or hate her, nobody could ignore her. And Justice Sotomayor? For the first time in her long career, she had been directly challenged in public, her authority tested in a way no one imagined possible. To some, she remained the symbol of order and dignity. To others, she represented an outdated system no longer capable of silencing dissent. But here's the truth. Both women had changed the landscape forever. Their clash wasn't just about that single moment. It had opened a wound in Washington, a wound that exposed the deep divides over power, respect, and the future of democracy itself. And as the dust settled, one thing became undeniable. This wasn't the end of the story. This was the beginning of a new battle. A battle over who truly controls the narrative, authority or defiance, order or truth. Because after that day, the words "sit down" would never mean the same again.